Let's face it, business technology is frustrating and complex. So how do you make sure it works for your team? To make IT right, start the discussion at go-domain.com. You're listening to Discussions by Domain, a podcast for business leaders. Our discussions may be with people you've probably heard of before, but the majority of our guests are in the trenches, professionals like you and I, with the same challenges and struggles of keeping up in the Northeast. They're implementing strategies, overcoming hurdles. They're leading the fastest growing businesses in our region. My name is Anthony DeGraw, Director of Partnerships at Domain Computer Services, and the host of this show. When I'm not talking with business leaders, you'll hear stories from behind the scenes of Domain and the ups and downs of our own growth journey, as we intend to take over the world. Just kidding. Well, maybe. Let's get into the show. So welcome to another episode of Discussions by Domain. Today, my guest is Judy Selby. She is the principal of Judy Selby Consulting LLC. Today, the topic is going to be completely around cyber insurance, which is very exciting for me because that is the area that I spent 10 years of my life in and then removed myself from. So I'm interested to get the updates. I'm now 2 years removed from my commercial insurance career, and I'd love to get the updates on cyber insurance and how that's affecting the business world and what the carriers are seeing. And Judy is my guest today. And I was going to read this really long bio on Judy, but I figured it's probably best to just hear it from her. So Judy, welcome to the show. And if you could start with giving us a little background on yourself.
Hi, Anthony. Thank you so much for inviting me to your podcast. I'm really excited. I always love talking to you, but for the podcast, it's really exciting. So my background is I'm a practicing lawyer, practiced for 25 years with big law firms, doing complex, high-stakes insurance coverage work, and litigated a bunch of cases in the U.S., arbitrated cases in London, really kind of, the high-end insurance coverage work. And then I was at my last law firm, and I started their e-discovery and technology practice because my cases were always so big. I always had a lot of data and discovery, that I had to deal with. And so I started the practice in that firm, mostly around the Madoff cases, to handle all the data and the case management issues we were dealing with handling over 1,200 individual litigations around Bernie Madoff and getting the money back to the victims of the Ponzi scheme. I also co-founded the firm's information governance team. So in connection with all of that, I took a real deep dive into cyber and privacy, took courses at MIT to try to really understand these issues, not to become a technologist, but to be able to speak to technical people and to understand the risks that are inherent with new technologies and interconnectedness, et cetera, et cetera. But of course, I'm, at heart an insurance person. So, I took the deep dive into coverage for these new and emerging types of risks caused by privacy and cyber concerns. And so about 2 years ago, I made the move out of the law firm and into consulting because so much of my work was becoming proactive and consultative in nature. And so what I do now is I work with companies around procuring the best cyber insurance for their particular needs, literally wordsmithing the policies. And because I kind of look at a policy the way an insurance company claims person might look at a policy, or the way a judge might look at a policy if there's a coverage dispute, and try to change the policy language, make it a little bit more clear so people know what they're covered for, what they're not covered for, and partner with a broker and try to get the best insurance program I can for my clients. And I also provide some consulting services around compliance with new privacy regulations and cyber regulations.
Yeah, that's a very hot topic now. I know from the information technology side, the IT and cybersecurity actual technology side, that we are always out in the marketplace making sure that individuals, business owners have cyber insurance as well. And we always tell them it doesn't matter how good of a job we do, how many technologies we purchase on your behalf and implement and manage, there is always going to be a percentage of risk that needs to be backed up by the insurance. And by working with both the insurance consultants like yourself, brokers, carriers, and the IT folks, if everybody gets together in the same room, which rarely happens, but if they do, the policy, the premiums, and the coverage language would all be in line with what is exactly going on. So I'm excited to have this conversation with you. So let's dive right into the cyber insurance topic here. What does cyber insurance typically cover?
Well, at its core, at the most fundamental level, cyber insurance covers a disclosure or a breach of confidential information that your company is holding. And so think data breach type of situation. The best probably the best component of the cyber coverage for especially for small and mid-sized companies is what we call the first party benefits of cyber insurance. And that means the cost to the entity itself, the company that has the cyber incident, whether, they have an employee who left, a laptop on a bus, or whether they've actually been hacked by bad guys. The cyber insurance companies have what I call a cyber SWAT team. They have panels of professionals that really kind of come to your rescue and help you deal with this breach situation, because the breach situation is bad in and of itself, but if it's not handled correctly, it can go from being just a bad thing to a disaster. And the insurance companies have panels of lawyers and forensic personnel, notification people, PR people, all of whom kind of come together under an attorney-client privilege, by the way, which is why, in my view, it's important to have this team headed up by an attorney, and try to get this breach under control, figure out if you have notice obligations, and handle the breach in an efficient way, comply with regulations, and hopefully get the breach resolved and put behind you as quickly as possible. The coverage also provides what we call third-party coverage, or liability coverage, if you have claims or lawsuits by customers or other people whose personal information has been disclosed, if you're investigated by regulators in connection with a cyber incident, that type of thing. So those are like the real basic components of cyber insurance. But there are a lot more components of it as well that are really, really important, especially with things that we're seeing now. The ransomware attacks that have been affecting cities lately, in particular, has been really, really highly publicized. And included in some of those publications, the news publications about those ransomware attacks, we're seeing that some of the cities have been covered by cyber insurance, and the cyber insurers have actually paid the ransoms. They actually negotiate the ransoms on behalf of the cities, and they went in there and did the remediation after the event. And so the coverage is really good for these new exposures. And, well, they're not so new anymore, unfortunately, but
Yeah.
these are the types of exposures that nobody is immune from. You had mentioned, Anthony, that you recommend to your clients, no matter how good your technology is, there's still a residual risk, and it's true. And no company is immune from things like, an employee clicking on a phishing email that leads to, either a breach or a ransomware attack or a business email compromise. And by the way, cyber policies now pretty typically do cover business email compromise, and that's the situation where you get an email. It's usually marked urgent. It's usually late in the day. Sometimes the sender is pretending to be an employee of your company, or they're pretending to be a vendor that you deal with. And it's always a situation where they're telling you to, there's a bank account change and you need to wire money right away to a new bank account or to a new client or to something like that. and it's all fraudulent, of course, and off the money goes to somewhere in China or someplace to the bad guys. Sometimes they'll request confidential information. And I was just dealing with a situation recently where a company has a very close relationship over 30 years with their small law firm, and the company does a lot of importing of goods from China. And I guess it was routine for the law firm to instruct the client to send funds to vendors for this amount or that amount. And so the company got an email from a paralegal at the law firm. Of course, it was spoofed. It wasn't a real one. The law firm had been hacked, and said, send $800,000, off to this bank account in Hong Kong. And they did, and it was all fake. And so there is coverage for that exposure as well. Now, there's some new coverages, some of which may post-date your involvement with insurance, Anthony. Things like bricking, property, cyber insurance policies typically don't cover property damage that can occur from a cyber event. They typically don't cover property damage, and some have a little bodily injury coverage, but many of them don't cover any bodily injury as a result of a cyber attack. But there's this new coverage called bricking coverage, and that happens when you have an incident where a malware causes your devices the devices themselves, the hardware has not been damaged, but the devices themselves are basically locked, and they're basically like a brick.
Yeah.
And they're kind of useless. And so instead of trying to remediate those devices, the insurance will pay to replace those devices. So that's a nice new coverage. And another coverage that's kind of like the flip side of the business email compromise or social engineering coverage that I just described is something called invoice manipulation coverage. So if I send an invoice to you and the bad guys intercept that message and they convert it and say, instead of my wire information, they put their wire information in there, and then you send off the money to them instead of to me, there's coverage there for me as the person who is not getting paid, as opposed to the person who sent the money off to the bad guys. So it's kind of the flip side of that.
Gotcha.
Yeah, and
those definitely didn't exist when I was in the business. So those are definitely interesting, and I'm glad you brought those up because I mean, all of those things were happening while we were there. Now, are these sub-limited, or are these getting access to the full limit? And is there a different deductible for these, or SIR? How are these laid out, these two coverages?
Well, you won't be shocked when I say it depends.
Yeah.
One thing I should have mentioned at the very beginning is that, and you know this very well, Anthony, there's no typical cyber insurance form. There's no standardized language. The one or two words difference in a policy can make all the difference when it comes to coverage. So it's hard to say. Some carriers are doing these types of things with no sublimits, but it's hard to say. It's hard to generalize because there's about 150 carriers writing the coverage now, and I wouldn't pretend to know what's in all of their forms.
Yeah.
But I can tell you that in my experience, they're often sublimited with a retention.
Very good. All right, and let's get into the common question I think you and I have probably answered 10,000 times. What about my existing general liability or professional liability policies? What do those give me nowadays in terms of cyber, and how should I be looking at these policies?
Well, I would be very, very careful, and I certainly wouldn't make any assumptions about them responding to in a complete and effective way to a cyber incident. Especially when it comes to those first-party type of coverages that I described, with the cyber SWAT team coming in and assisting after an event. General liability policies for a number of years now, I think going back to maybe 2010 or so, Anthony, maybe you remember exactly. They have exclusions for cyber, And there are some cases pending out there where people are trying to get some kind of coverage under coverage B of a GL coverage a policy, which is personal injury and advertising injury. But what I tell my clients is nobody wants to buy a coverage dispute. And I think with cyber, the stakes are so high. Many of these incidents that companies are suffering, we just saw, for example, a high-profile bankruptcy that a company just had to file because of a cyber incident, a data breach. I think the stakes are too high. The risk can be existential for companies. And so you don't want to buy a GL policy and I hope I have coverage here, or I hope I have coverage for business email compromise under my crime policies, because some courts say yes while other courts say no. And again, you don't get that good first party coverage under any of these forms. So my advice to companies is really, really take a hard look at a standalone cyber insurance policy. I often see cyber coverages endorsed to more traditional policy forms, a professional liability form, a crime policy, a GL policy. But you have to be really careful about that, because again, the coverage is probably not as nearly as complete as what you get under a cyber form. Plus, you could be eroding your limits if you're adding more coverages onto an existing form. You have to take into account those new exposures. And so if you're doing it to save money, you may not realize too much of a savings if you're having to increase the limits under those forms to make up for the new exposures under the new cyber coverage.
Yeah, I completely agree. I remember when I was doing it, I would say as soon as carriers endorse something or what looks like they've added coverage on, what they're really saying is, we know this exists. We want to address it, and we want to put a sublimit here so we know exactly what our out-of-pocket is going to be when it happens. And that's why you should be very scared of endorsements in that fact. And then the second point also is, I think as more and more carriers have written this, like you said, there's probably 150 players in the marketplace. What I saw as I was getting out is they're basically saying, we don't want to cover this exposure on your GL or your professional. We have another product that covers this exposure, and we want you to go there for it. And if you're not going to do that, then we're going to cover our basis on this policy over here.
Yeah, I think that's really true. And we're seeing some real examples of that now, in terms of some coverage litigations that are going on where, for whatever reason, some cyber exposure was written into some property forms, and now there's pushback on whether the claims are going to be covered or not. And I think we'll see an attempt on the cyber insurance company side to push those types of exposures exclusively into cyber policies. And I don't know, I'm just not a big fan of tacking a lot of coverages onto existing policy forms. Again, the coverage typically isn't as complete, and endorsements generally make me nervous. You have to be so careful about them. There's an endorsement that I recently saw that says GDPR endorsement. And so, the General Data Protection Regulation. So the untrained person might look at that and say, oh, great, I have coverage for GDPR. And it's basically saying, we will cover, out of 99 articles of GDPR, we will cover you for 4 things. So you have to be super careful with, I'm a big believer, and this is what I do for a living. I read every word in insurance policies, because that's what I believe has to be done. That's where the devil's in the details. And
completely agree.
You can't look at just the title of a grant of coverage or an endorsement and say, oh, check the box, we're good here.
Yeah, 100% agree with that. I used to say that that's where all the opportunity for individuals like yourself and I exist, is that every single one of those policies is different. And you can always, as long as you're on top of the market, can always find a better policy form or ways to add value to their current policy form by negotiating coverage and language and wording and everything like that. So I'm glad you're out there doing that.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, that's a really good point, Anthony, because it's still a soft market. We'll see how long it stays a soft market. But insurers, even smaller companies, have tremendous opportunities now to get good coverage for a really good price and to negotiate for more favorable terms.
Yeah, completely agree. I want to switch. You had a point in our pre-conversations about, and it's been making some waves in the news, maybe in a false manner. But talk to me about this war exclusion and what that means, where you've seen it, and what's actually going on in this war exclusion.
Yeah, there's been a lot of bad reporting out there about the war exclusion and cyber insurance. And the reason it's bad reporting is that the cases that have actually been filed, there's been two cases I know of that have been filed. And one is by, I think it's pronounced Mondelez, and the other one was filed by Merck. And Mondelez, by the way, is a company that makes Oreos and all other kinds of snack foods, so it's a very important company. Merck makes drugs, so they're important too, I suppose. But both of those companies had property insurance policies that apparently contained, I don't know if it was by endorsement or what, because I haven't seen the policies. And all my information, by the way, is from reading the complaints. I have the complaints, but I don't have anything else. So, it's not complete information. But according to the complaints, the property insurers denied coverage for those claims. And in both of those claims, the insureds had been hit by NotPetya. And sustained really massive losses, global companies that were pretty much shut down. So they had tremendous business interruption losses. And I can't even imagine how much they just state in their complaints that they exceed the available coverage, and the available coverage is pretty substantial. So they were cyber claims, that is for sure, that the insureds made, but they were not cyber policies; they were property policies. And in both of those cases, according to the complaints, the insurance company denied coverage, citing the war exclusion. And that's an exclusion that's found in all different types of insurance policies, not just property policies or cyber policies. And the wordings of those exclusions vary dramatically from policy to policy. But the gist of it is that, they say we're not going to pay for losses that arise out of war or a warlike event. Sometimes they'll say between nation states, sometimes they won't, sometimes it'll say declared war, sometimes it doesn't say declared war. So it's a little bit hard to generalize, but the point is, they say this was a war. There was public attribution that NotPetya was malware that was created in Russia or sent by Russia to the Ukraine. And these companies were kind of collateral damage of this warlike act by Russia against the Ukraine. And the U.S. government and the U.K. government apparently made that attribution publicly. And so there was a lot of reporting that said that cyber insurance policies were not covering NotPetya or other types of events because of the war exclusions in their policies, which isn't true. In fact, in the Merck complaint, they actually state that they have cyber insurance coverage, and that cyber insurers had not contested coverage and were paying the claim. So the reason that it's not irrelevant, though, this whole discussion of the war exclusion is not irrelevant in the context of cyber insurance, is because the cyber policies typically do have a war exclusion in them. And I've seen a couple of policies that don't have a war exclusion, but I think it's much more common that they do have one. So the question then becomes, what do you do? Because a lot of these types of major events, in theory, can be traced to a nation state. So how do you handle it? So, going back to our discussion a minute ago, that these forms are negotiable, the first thing I would attempt to do is, try to get the exclusion removed from the policy. and you may or may not have success in doing that. Sometimes the insurer's hands are tied because the reinsurers won't let them take that exclusion out.
Correct.
Yeah. So a second thing you can do, though, is try to modify it. You can try to get an exception, for example, in the exclusion that basically would say, yeah, we're excluding war, but this type of an event, that affects our computer system would not fall within the exclusion. Or you can try to modify the exclusion by having them insert the term kinetic warfare, meaning, bullets are flying, rockets are flying type of situation, as opposed to a cyber type of war. And, as a last resort, you can also try to get some, if you're unsuccessful with everything else, you can try to get some type of representation in writing from the insurer that they don't intend to utilize the exclusion in that way, that we're paying these type of malware claims or whatever. Now, I can tell you as a coverage lawyer, getting that admitted into court is an uphill battle. You'd have to have a finding by the court of ambiguity in the insurance policy, and then a second finding that parole or extrinsic evidence is admissible in the coverage dispute, which without getting into too many more details about that, is not easy to do. Yeah. And so it's a real last resort, but in most cases, it's probably still worth it to get the coverage rather than to not get the coverage, because you may have a situation where this exclusion would be invoked. But to my knowledge, and I've done a lot of research on this issue, it has never been invoked by a cyber insurer.
No, this makes a lot of sense. I'm glad you're bringing this up, because I think it's just going to continue to expand. I mean, we see more and more nation-state threat actors acting on this. So whether it's Russia, China, North Korea, it doesn't matter. It's going to be more and more, and it's in the news every single day of the U.S. versus whoever. And it's just going to continue, and they're going to keep going after governments, right? They're going to keep going after private businesses. In the last month, we've seen a huge uptake in the amount of businesses that are suffering from ransomware attacks. We're even seeing it in our own industry, where we're in an industry called managed service providers or managed IT service providers. And who better to go after than the organizations and the third parties that have the keys to 100, 200, 300 businesses. It's a big thing for them. So I think this is going to continue to develop in your world of what does this war exclusion look like? How do we define when it is actually war, and how do we know what's going on? Because I do think that is the new battlefront is in this area. So interesting for you to stay on top of and continue to help your clients here.
Yeah, I agree with everything that you just said, and we just don't know. There was just I just reported on a case. I wrote an article over the weekend about this. There was a policy, not a cyber policy, a policy, television production policy. So a company, the insured, was filming in Israel during a conflict with Hamas. Okay. And Hamas started launching rockets into Israel, and they had to move their production, which was very expensive and fell right within this grant of coverage of the policy for this type of situation. The insurer invoked the war exclusion. They went through the whole analysis of the particular wording of that war exclusion, and which required actions by kind of nation states. And the court took a lot of evidence in, actually, from insurance treatises and from an insurance expert. And they said war has a special meaning in an insurance policy, and it means actions between sovereigns, like sovereign states. And they concluded that Hamas was not a sovereign state, and Israel's involvement as a sovereign state did not implicate the exclusion, because they didn't move the production because Israel was firing rockets into Gaza. They left because Hamas was firing rockets into Israel. And so they found that the exclusion didn't apply. So it's an interesting as we're struggling with what is warfare now in light of all our interconnectivity and technical dependence. It'll be interesting to see how this all shakes out, but it's important to try to stay ahead of these issues. And a lot of us have been afraid of these exclusions and the terrorism exclusion kind of, rearing their heads. But that's the interesting thing about this whole area. And I think you'll agree, Anthony, is that, we're not just looking to where the puck is, we're looking to where the puck is going, to quote the great Wayne Gretzky.
Yeah. It's so true. And it's
Yeah.
I think it's still like, it feels like it's been going on forever. But I still feel like it's in such infancy. I was just seeing the other day that I think it was a Russian submarine that a bunch of sailors died on from smoke inhalation on a fire on the submarine was supposedly being used to potentially cut the world's internet cables that were connecting across oceans. And it's just like, it's amazing where this may all potentially go. And it's just the start.
That's right. Don't throw out your typewriter.
To ensure that you never miss an episode, subscribe to the show in iTunes or your favorite podcast player. This guarantees that every episode will get delivered directly to your device. To help us get the word out, share with a friend, leave a review, and check out our discussions on the web at go-domain.com/podcast. Thank you so much for listening. Until next time.